The Forgotten Man. The city streets bustled with life, yet John Turner was invisible. He had been for the last 17 years. The pedestrians walking by never made eye contact, their gazes deliberately skipping over him as though he were part of the pavement, a blemish they wished to ignore. John sat on his usual spot, a cracked and weathered bench in front of an old convenience store. The metal frame groaned under his thin frame, his body reduced to little more than bones wrapped in worn, dirt-streaked clothes. His hands, rough and cracked from years of exposure, held a faded cardboard sign. The words scrawled across it in black marker had long since begun to smudge, but their message remained clear. I used to be someone. Few stopped to read it. Fewer still cared. John had been on the streets so long that the days blurred together, an endless cycle of cold, hunger, and rejection. The world had moved on without him, and he had accepted it. The occasional kind soul might drop a few coins into his rusted tin cup, but for the most part, he was met with indifference or outright cruelty. Like today, a well-dressed man in a dark suit walked past, then suddenly paused. John's stomach clenched with cautious hope. Perhaps this man would spare some change, or even offer a kind word. But as the man turned, a sneer twisted his sharp features. Used to be someone. He scoffed. Yeah, right. I bet you never were. Before John could respond, the man lashed out with his foot, kicking the tin cup over. The scattered coins clattered against the pavement, rolling into the cracks of the sidewalk and disappearing down the storm drain. The man's laughter was cold and sharp, like glass breaking. Maybe next time, right? I used to have a spine. He taunted before walking away, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. John sat frozen for a moment, his breath hitching. Then, with stiff, aching movements, he lowered himself onto his knees, fumbling to retrieve what little remained of his dignity. He felt the stares of those around him, but no one stopped to help. A businessman, a young couple, a group of teenagers, all walked past as if he didn't exist. He pressed his palm against the pavement, the rough texture biting into his skin as he reached for a quarter wedged between the cracks. His arthritis flared, making his fingers tremble. He had once been strong, once been capable. Now he was just this, pathetic. By the time he had collected the last of the scattered change, the man who had humiliated him was long gone. John sighed, his breath heavy with exhaustion, and pushed himself back onto the bench. His hands trembled as he clutched his sign tighter, his knuckles white. A world that had forgotten him. John didn't remember exactly when he had become invisible. Perhaps it was when he had lost his job, or when he had been evicted from his tiny apartment. Or maybe it was the day he had stopped looking in mirrors because he no longer recognized the man staring back at him. He once had a life, a home, a purpose. Now he had a tattered blanket, an empty stomach, and a cardboard sign that told a story no one cared to hear. As the day wore on, the city pulsed around him. A hot dog vendor across the street was serving up fresh, steaming sausages, their aroma thick with spices. John's stomach clenched painfully at the smell. With what little money he had, he approached the stand. The vendor barely looked at him before waving him away. Not enough. Move along. John swallowed hard and shuffled back toward the park, his hunger gnawing at his insides. As he passed a drinking fountain, he saw a young mother filling a water bottle while her toddler tugged impatiently at her sleeve. The little boy's curious eyes locked onto John's, and for a fleeting moment, the child smiled and waved. John managed a small smile in return, raising his hand in greeting. "Don't look at him," the mother hissed, yanking her child away. "Come on, we'll go somewhere else." The rejection stung more than the hunger. A song from the past. John settled back onto his bench, the weight of the world pressing down on his frail shoulders. The ache in his bones deepened, a constant reminder of time's cruelty. Then something unexpected happened. A melody floated through the air, soft and familiar. A young musician had set up his guitar near the park fountain, his fingers plucking at the strings with practiced ease. The tune was one John hadn't heard in decades, but he recognized it instantly. It was a song from his past, a song he used to sing, used to be someone. The lyrics hit him like a sledgehammer. They spoke of faded dreams, lost time, and a longing for something that once was. John found himself mouthing the words, his voice barely above a whisper. The music pulled at memories long buried, his fingers gliding over piano keys, the laughter of a child at his side, the warmth of a home that no longer existed. Before he knew what he was doing, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single crumpled dollar bill. It was all he had left. With a trembling hand, he walked toward the musician and dropped the bill into the open guitar case. The young man looked up in surprise. "Thank you, sir," he said sincerely. John nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering across his face. "You entertain my soul," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, he had felt human. But the moment passed too quickly, and as the last note faded into silence, reality came crashing back. John turned away and resumed his slow, unsteady walk down the street, carrying nothing but the weight of memories. But dark memory returns. He found himself in an alley behind a supermarket, where he often searched for discarded food. But today, he wasn't alone. Another homeless man was already digging through the dumpster, his hands desperate as he pulled out a half-eaten sandwich. Before John could decide whether to wait or move on, the back door of the store slammed open. The manager stormed out, his face red with anger. "Get out of here. Filthy rats, the lot of you," he shouted, grabbing the other man by his coat and shoving him to the ground. John's breath hitched. The scene before him twisted, morphing into something else. Suddenly, he wasn't in the alley anymore. He was back in a war zone. Gunfire rattled the air. Smoke filled his lungs. He could hear the desperate shouts of his fellow soldiers, the acrid scent of blood and gunpowder thick in the air. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the pavement, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The world around him was spinning, trapped between past and present. Then, through the haze, he heard a sound that snapped him back. A car horn. A sleek, black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a man. Dressed in an elegant emerald blue vest, the stranger locked eyes with John. Recognition flickered in the man's gaze. John's breath caught. Who was he? And why was he looking at him like that? Shadows of the past. The city hummed around John as he sat frozen, his breath coming in uneven gasps. His mind still reeled from the memory that had seized him in the alley. The flashback so real he could almost smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and hear the desperate cries of his comrades. But it was the sleek, black SUV now idling at the curb that truly set his pulse racing. The door had swung open with a smooth, deliberate motion, and out stepped a man who looked completely out of place in this part of town. Tall, well-groomed, sharp suit with an emerald blue vest that caught the light just enough to exude wealth but not arrogance. His shoes were polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the grime-covered sidewalk. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. One man draped in the elegance of success, the other swallowed by the rags of survival. John's instincts screamed at him to retreat. People like this never stopped for people like him. If they noticed him at all, it was usually with disgust, or at best, distant pity. But this man, he wasn't just looking at John, he was studying him. And there was something else, something unsettlingly familiar in his eyes. John's throat tightened. Who was this man? And why was he looking at him like that? The unexpected encounter. The businessman hesitated for just a second before stepping toward John. His movements were deliberate, cautious, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any second. John's fingers unconsciously curled around the edges of his tattered coat, as if shielding himself from a storm he couldn't see coming. "Sir," the man said finally, his voice smooth yet hesitant, as if he was weighing each word carefully. John flinched at the address. It had been years since anyone had called him sir. The man's eyes flickered to the battered cardboard sign, still clutched in John's hands. His lips pressed into a thin line. I used to be someone. John had seen 1,000 different reactions to those words. Mockery, indifference, discomfort. But this man didn't scoff. His expression darkened, his brows knitting together in an emotion John couldn't quite place. Sympathy, recognition, regret. Do you need help? The man asked, his voice quieter now. John's spine stiffened. He had learned to recognize charity when it came, and while the intention behind it might have been kind, the acceptance of it always felt like swallowing broken glass. Don't need no handouts, John muttered, his voice raspier than he intended. The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. That's not what I meant. There was a flicker of something in his expression, a crack in his composure, a glimpse of something raw beneath the expensive suit. For the briefest moment, John saw something he didn't expect. This man wasn't just looking at him. He was searching for him. And then, "Excuse me, sir," a gruff voice interrupted. A police officer had approached from the side, his hand resting on his belt. His expression was carefully neutral, but John knew that look all too well. The businessman turned toward the officer, his expression instantly shifting into one of practiced politeness. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer's gaze flicked between the two men before settling on John. "Just making sure everything's all right. We've had complaints from the local businesses about vagrants loitering too close to the storefronts." John clenched his jaw. He knew this script by heart. First came the concerned citizen complaint, then the warning. If he didn't move fast enough, there would be handcuffs. The businessman's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His shoulders squared, his presence somehow becoming even more commanding. "There's no issue here," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably authoritative. "I was just having a conversation with Mr." His sentence trailed off, waiting for John to fill in the blank. For a moment, John hesitated. His name had lost meaning over the years. He had become just another forgotten ghost wandering the streets. But something about the way this man looked at him, expectantly, made him remember. "Turner," he said hoarsely. "John Turner." The businessman's eyes widened just slightly, so fast that if John hadn't been watching closely, he might have missed it. "Mr. Turner and I are having a private discussion," the businessman continued, turning back to the officer. "That's not a crime, is it?" The cop hesitated, clearly thrown off by the confident challenge. He adjusted his stance, glancing at John again before signing. "Just don't cause any trouble," he muttered before walking away. John let out a slow breath, his hands tightening around the fabric of his coat. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, the ever-present readiness to run if things turned ugly. "You didn't have to do that," John said after a moment. The businessman studied him again, that strange look still in his eyes. "I know." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, almost reluctantly, the businessman reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a sleek black wallet. He retrieved a few crisp bills, more money than John had seen in months, and held them out. "Take it," he said simply. John's pride bristled, but his empty stomach twisted painfully at the sight of the money. He had a choice. He could turn it down and continue suffering out of stubbornness, or he could swallow what little pride he had left and accept a chance, however small, at surviving another day. After a long hesitation, John reached out. His fingers brushed against the businessman's as he took the money. Their eyes met again. And this time, John was certain. This man knew him. But before he could ask, a sharp honk cut through the air. The businessman's head turned toward the SUV, where another sharply dressed man was waving impatiently from the driver's seat. "Coming," the man called back. Then to John, he said, "Take care of yourself, Mr. Turner." And just like that, he was gone. John stood frozen, gripping the money in his trembling hands. The weight of the encounter sat heavy on his chest. Who was that man? And why did John feel like he should remember him? Falling back into shadows, the questions burned in his mind as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. The money in his pocket should have felt like salvation, but instead, it felt like a brand, marking him with something he couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Recognition? A warning? By the time the sun began to set, John found himself back in familiar territory, the liquor store. His hand shook as he stared through the glass at the rows of bottles, each one promising a few hours of silence from the storm raging in his mind. Just one. Just enough to take the edge off. He stepped inside. The clerk barely looked up as John approached the counter, placing a cheap bottle of whiskey on the surface. $3, the clerk muttered. John hesitated. The crisp bills were still clenched in his hand. The money from the man in the emerald blue vest. He could use it for food, a shelter, a fresh start. Or, with a heavy heart, John placed one of the bills on the counter. The clerk made no comment as he handed over the bottle. As John stepped back out into the street, the city lights flickering around him, he uncapped the bottle and took a long, burning sip. And just like that, he let the shadows swallow him again. But deep down, he knew something was coming for him. And this time, there would be no hiding from it. A name long forgotten. John Turner sat in the back of an abandoned parking lot, the near-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. The city had long since turned dark, the neon glow of storefront signs flickering in the distance. He was cold, hungry, and exhausted, but at least the alcohol dulled the sharp edges of his thoughts, if only for a little while. The businessman in the emerald blue vest haunted his mind. It wasn't just the way the man had looked at him. It wasn't just the sharp suit or the crisp money. It was his eyes. Eyes that had widened in recognition. Eyes that knew him. John had met thousands of people in his lifetime. Strangers, comrades, enemies. He had lost friends to war and family to time. He had seen death. He had seen life. He had seen hope flicker and fade. But he had never seen a man look at him like that before, like he had found something he had been looking for. John rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that settled deep in his gut. The liquor was supposed to help, but instead, it made the memory sharper, like glass slicing through the fog of his mind. Who was he? Why did he care? More importantly, why did John feel like he should remember him? Ghosts of another life. The streetlights flickered overhead as John stood, his joints stiff with pain. He needed to move before someone found him. Cops, store owners, gang members, it didn't matter. No one wanted a homeless man around. With slow, uneven steps, he walked toward the main street. His breath came in shallow puffs against the cold air, his tattered coat barely providing any warmth. He needed to find food. The whiskey had numbed his body, but his stomach twisted violently in protest. It had been nearly 2 days since he had eaten anything substantial. The half-eaten sandwich he had found in a dumpster yesterday had only made things worse, the stale bread and spoiled meat churning in his gut. Across the street, a small diner's "Open Late" sign flickered in the window. John paused, staring at it. He knew better than to hope. He had tried before. Tried to walk into places like this, tried to ask for something, anything. And every time, the result was the same. Rejection, disgust, cruelty. Still, the businessman's money was still in his pocket. A crisp $20 bill. For the first time in years, he had enough to buy real food. His heart pounded as he forced his feet to move. One step, then another. The warmth from the diner's neon glow made his fingers twitch with longing. He reached for the handle. Then, "Hold on there, buddy." The voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. John barely had time to turn before a burly man in a grease-stained apron stepped outside, blocking the entrance. His expression twisted with instant disdain. "We don't serve your kind here." John's fingers clenched around the money in his pocket. His voice cracked from disuse. I have money. The man sneered. Yeah, and I bet I know exactly where you got it. John's stomach twisted. Please, he tried again. Just a meal. But the man was already stepping forward, his meaty hands pushing John back. I said get lost. With one final shove, John stumbled backward onto the sidewalk, landing hard on the cold pavement. Laughter erupted from a group of young men standing nearby. Damn, that was brutal. Did you see him fall? Old dude almost broke his back. John sat there, humiliated, his hands curling into fists against the concrete. His chest ached, not just from the fall, but from everything. From the rejection, from the hunger, from the past, from existing. The diner door slammed shut. The world moved on. And John Turner sat alone in the dark. A familiar voice. John didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes, hours, maybe even days. But when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of him, he knew. It was him, the businessman in the emerald blue vest. The door swung open. John's pulse pounded. Not with fear, not with anger. With something else. Something that felt a lot like fate. The man stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He was alone this time. No impatient colleagues. No fancy restaurant meetings. Just him. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at John. John looked back. The silence stretched between them, thick with questions. Then, John Turner. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Like he had known it all along. Like he had been waiting for this moment. John swallowed. His throat was dry, his voice barely more than a whisper. Who are you? The man took a slow breath. Then, my name is Frederick Turner. The world stopped. John's breath caught. His heart stumbled. The name hit him like a hammer to the chest. Frederick. Fred. His son. John's vision swam. The whiskey in his stomach churned violently. His hands trembled. No, it wasn't possible. Fred was gone. Fred had been taken from him. Fred had left. But now, he was standing right in front of him. I don't. John's voice broke. I don't understand. Fred's jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists at his sides, as if he was barely keeping his emotions in check. I've been looking for you, Dad. Dad. John's chest tightened. No one had called him that in nearly 2 decades. Why? His voice was barely above a whisper. Fred exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because you never left me. John's mind raced. This wasn't real. This was some cruel joke. Some hallucination brought on by too much alcohol and too little food. But Fred was real. His face, his voice, his eyes. And John knew, deep in his bones, this was his son. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he couldn't cry. Not yet. Not until he understood. What do you want from me? John croaked. Fred took a step forward. Just one thing, he said softly. Come with me. John's heart stopped. He looked at the outstretched hand, then at his own. Dirty, calloused, worn. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve him. But Fred was waiting. His son was waiting. And for the first time in 17 years, John Turner reached out and took his hand. The weight of the past. John Turner sat in the passenger seat of the sleek black SUV, his body rigid with tension. The luxury of the vehicle was suffocating in a way he hadn't expected. The leather seats were too smooth, the air too clean, the silence too heavy. This wasn't his world. It hadn't been for a long, long time. Fred, his son, was gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. His jaw was set, his knuckles white from how tightly he was holding the steering wheel. He hadn't spoken much since they left the curb, and John wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. This was real. This wasn't a dream. The little boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the child who had laughed in his arms, the son he had lost, was driving him home. A lump formed in John's throat, but he forced it down. Don't get your hopes up, old man. A home that wasn't his. When the SUV finally rolled to a stop, John almost didn't move. He stared out the window at the sprawling house. No mansion before him. A place so large, so polished, it looked like something out of a dream. The front yard was manicured to perfection, the driveway paved with smooth stones that glowed under the porch lights. The house itself stood tall and proud, with massive windows reflecting the dim light of the evening sky. John had spent years sleeping on damp concrete and hard benches, using a cardboard sign as a makeshift pillow. He didn't belong here. He hesitated, fingers gripping the edges of his tattered coat. Fred must have sensed his hesitation, because he turned the engine off and turned to face John. "Come on," he said softly. John swallowed hard. This is a mistake. He should get out. He should run. But he didn't. His body moved before his mind could stop it, his stiff legs carrying him out of the car and onto the smooth driveway. The contrast between his filthy shoes and the clean pavement made his chest tighten. Fred led him to the door and pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, the warmth of the house hit John like a physical force. The scent of something clean, something safe wrapped around him, and he instinctively stepped back. The high ceilings, the shining wooden floors, the elegant furniture, it was all too much. He shouldn't be here. But then Fred turned to him and spoke the words that shattered the walls John had spent years building. "Welcome home, Dad." Memories long buried. John couldn't move. He had been called many things over the years. Bum, waste of space, nobody. But not Dad. Not for 17 years. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep it together. This ain't my home, son." His voice was rough, weary. "It's yours." Fred didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he understood that John wasn't ready to accept this yet. "Then let's just call it a place where you can rest," Fred said. "For now." John swallowed, looking around the vast living room. His hands twitched at his sides, unused to being in a place so untouched by struggle. "Come with me," Fred said. "There's something I want to show you." John followed, his footsteps hesitant as they walked down a long hallway. The walls were lined with photos, moments frozen in time, pieces of a life John had missed. His son's life. A photo of Fred as a teenager in a graduation cap. Another of him shaking hands with business partners. A picture of him in an expensive suit, standing in front of a massive office building. But then John's eyes landed on something that made his breath catch. A photo, their photo. Him, holding a tiny, laughing Fred in his arms. The boy had been no more than 5, clutching onto John's shirt as if he would never let go. John reached out, his fingers barely brushing the edge of the frame. You kept this." His voice was barely above a whisper. Fred nodded. "It's the only picture I had of us," he admitted. "I never forgot you, Dad." John closed his eyes. The weight of the years crushed him in that moment. The regret, the pain, the time he had lost. And yet, his son had kept this memory alive. A meal unlike any other. Fred guided him toward the kitchen, where a familiar scent filled the air. John froze. "It's that." "Tomato soup and an omelette," Fred said with a small smile. "Your recipe." John's heart clenched. He had made that meal for Fred when he was a boy, whenever he had a bad day, whenever he was sick. It was simple, but it had been their tradition. Fred placed a bowl in front of him, steam rising from the soup. "Eat." John hesitated. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from everything else. He wasn't sure if he could do this, if he could sit at a table that wasn't made of concrete, eat food that wasn't stolen or spoiled. Fred must have seen the hesitation in his eyes because he reached out, placing a hand over John's. You don't have to prove anything to me, Fred said gently. Just eat. John swallowed, then picked up the spoon. The first taste hit him like a punch to the gut, because it tasted like home, like warmth, like safety, like something he had thought he would never have again. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he forced them down. Fred didn't push. He simply sat across from John, eating in silence. And for the first time in 17 years, John felt human again. The unspoken words. After dinner, Fred led John upstairs to a room, his room. Clean sheets, a soft bed, a dresser filled with fresh clothes. John stood at the doorway, staring. I can't stay here, he muttered. His voice wavered. This is too much. Fred stepped beside him. You don't have to decide anything now, he said. Just try. John's hands curled into fists. He wanted to run, to disappear. But the exhaustion weighed him down, maybe just for tonight. With stiff movements, he walked inside and sat on the edge of the bed. He had slept on benches, sidewalks, and cold alleyways, but never something like this. Fred hovered in the doorway. If you need anything, I'll be right down the hall. John didn't answer. Fred hesitated, then spoke again. Softer this time. I love you, Dad. The words hit John harder than any battle, any loss, any hunger. But he couldn't say them back. Not yet. Not after everything he had done. Fred didn't seem to expect an answer. He simply nodded and stepped out, leaving John alone. The silence pressed in on him. The bed was too soft. The room was too warm. The ghosts of his past were too loud. And for the first time in years, he didn't know if he would make it through the night. But as he lay down, the last thing he saw before closing his eyes was the framed photo on the nightstand. Him and his son, smiling. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow wouldn't be so bad. The battle within. The room was silent. Too silent. John Turner lay on the soft bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like an intruder in his own son's home. The mattress cradled his aching bones in a way that should have been comforting, yet it wasn't. It was unsettling. He had spent 17 years sleeping on sidewalks, under bridges, on benches, curled up in alleyways where rats scurried by like clockwork. The concrete had become his bed, the sound of passing cars his lullaby. Now he was in a house so quiet, so still, that it felt like he was floating in some kind of dream. John turned his head slightly. The photograph on the nightstand, the one of him and Fred, stared back at him. His younger self smiled in that picture, eyes full of life. A man who had purpose. A man who had been someone. That man was dead. Or was he? John exhaled shakily and sat up, rubbing his face with his rough, calloused hands. His fingers twitched for something. A drink, a cigarette, anything to dull the storm raging in his mind. But he had neither. What he did have was time. And that was the worst thing of all. He had spent years numbing himself, avoiding his past, drowning in alcohol to keep his memories at bay. But now, sitting in this house, surrounded by warmth, kindness, and the remnants of a life he had lost, there was nowhere to hide. The weight of it all came crashing down. Fred, his son, the boy he had failed, the man who had found him anyway. John swallowed thickly, his throat burning, his fingers clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. How had Fred even found him? Why had he searched? And more importantly, why did he still care? A voice in the night. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second dragging into eternity. John tried to force his body to relax, but the unease wouldn't let him rest. After what felt like an hour, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood. His body protested, his joints stiff and aching. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the weight of something he couldn't quite name. He needed air. Silently, he stepped out of the room, his bare feet meeting the smooth hardwood floor. The house was dimly lit, the glow from a single lamp in the hallway casting soft shadows along the walls. He made his way downstairs, the grand staircase unfamiliar beneath his unsteady steps. He wasn't sure where he was going, just that he needed to move. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard something. A voice. Soft. Low. Almost. Broken. Fred. John followed the sound, his steps quiet, his heart pounding for reasons he didn't understand. When he reached the doorway to the living room, he stopped. Fred was sitting on the couch, a phone pressed to his ear. His back was turned, his shoulders tense. John hesitated, about to step away, but then, "No, Mom, I'm not kicking him out." John froze. Fred's voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it, something sharp, something raw. "Yes, I know what I'm doing." A pause. "Because he's my father." Another pause. Fred let out a slow breath. "I don't expect you to understand. You never did." John's breath caught. He was talking to her. His ex-wife. The woman who had left him all those years ago. The mother of his child. Fred's voice dropped lower, quieter. "I spent my whole life thinking he abandoned me. Thinking he didn't care. But now I know the truth." John's hands curled into fists. "I know he's not perfect," Fred continued. "I know he's made mistakes, but so have I. So have you. And I'm not going to turn my back on him now just because it's easier." Silence. Then, "Good night, Mom." The call ended. Fred sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hands. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. John took a step back, his mind spinning. He had always assumed Fred had hated him. And yet, his son had fought for him. Even now, even against his own mother. Fred had chosen him. John's throat tightened. He turned away before Fred could notice him standing there, retreating back up the stairs as quietly as he had come. His heart was pounding. Not from fear. Not from shame. But from something else. Something he had long since forgotten how to feel. Hope. The morning that changed everything. When John woke the next morning, the world felt different. The walls of the room weren't just walls anymore. The bed wasn't just a bed. And Fred wasn't just some man who had given him a second chance. He was his son. And maybe, just maybe, John wasn't too far gone to fix things. He got up, stretching his stiff limbs, and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't the soldier he used to be. Wasn't the man he had once been. But he wasn't the broken ghost he had become either. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to save. Downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the air. John hesitated, then walked toward the kitchen. Fred was there, sitting at the table, a mug in his hands. He looked up as John entered. "Morning," Fred said, his voice easy. No judgment, no pity. John nodded, clearing his throat. "Morning." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Fred gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, eat." John hesitated, but then he did. As he took the first bite of food, warm, real, earned, something in him shifted. The weight of his past was still there. The scars weren't erased. But for the first time in 17 years, he wasn't carrying them alone. The road to redemption. The morning light streamed through the large kitchen windows, casting soft golden hues across the marble countertops. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of eggs sizzling on the stove. It was warm, comforting, unfamiliar. John Turner sat at the dining table, still stiff, still uncertain. His hands hovered over a steaming plate of food, scrambled eggs, toast, and crispy bacon. A meal that, not too long ago, would have been nothing more than a dream. Across from him, Fred sipped his coffee in silence, his gaze unreadable. He hadn't pushed John to talk, hadn't overwhelmed him with questions. And for that, John was grateful. Even so, the silence between them was thick. Not uncomfortable, but full. Like the weight of the past sat between them, waiting for someone to speak first. John picked up his fork, staring at the food for a long moment before finally taking a bite. It tasted like something he hadn't had in years. Dignity. He chewed slowly, forcing himself to savor it, to accept it. But a part of him, the part that had spent 17 years on the streets, that had learned to expect nothing but cold pavement and colder glares, couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't deserve this. His son had opened his home to him, fed him, given him a bed to sleep in. But John knew this was temporary. Nothing good lasted forever. He had seen it too many times before. Facing the mirror. After breakfast, Fred led John down a long hallway to a guest bathroom. "You should take a shower," Fred said, his tone careful, as if he expected John to resist. John hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure he could handle what he would see. He had avoided mirrors for years. The last time he had truly looked at himself, he had still been a man, still been someone. But the world had stripped that away. Now he was nothing but a shell. Still, he forced himself to step inside. Fred left him alone, and the door closed with a soft click. The bathroom was pristine, white-tiled, smelling faintly of citrus and soap. The contrast between it and the filth clinging to his skin was almost unbearable. John took a slow breath and stepped toward the mirror above the sink. What he saw made his stomach clench. A man stared back at him. But he wasn't John Turner. He was someone else. Someone lost. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow. His once strong jawline was obscured by a thick, unkempt beard, streaked with gray and tangled with neglect. His skin was rough, weathered from years of exposure to the elements. His eyes, God, his eyes. They were dull, empty. Once they had been sharp, filled with purpose. They had belonged to a soldier, a father, a husband. Now they belonged to a ghost. John gripped the edges of the sink, his breath uneven. What had he become? His fingers curled, knuckles turning white against the porcelain. 17 years. 17 years of struggle, of drinking himself into oblivion, of surviving instead of living. Was this really all he had left? His gaze flickered to the running shower, steam already curling from behind the curtain. Maybe, just maybe, he could wash some of it away. Scrubbing away the past. The hot water hit his skin, and John exhaled sharply. It burned, not just from the heat, but from the sheer contrast of it. He had grown so used to the cold, to the ache of winter seeping into his bones, that the warmth felt almost foreign. The water ran brown as it cascaded down his body, years of dirt and grime peeling away like old scars. John stood under the spray for what felt like hours. He scrubbed hard, too hard, as if he could erase everything he had been, as if he could scrape away the mistakes, the regrets, the years of suffering. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, the memories remained. They always would. A fresh start, or something like it. By the time John stepped out of the shower, his body felt lighter, not clean, but cleaner. Fred had left fresh clothes for him on the counter. A simple white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. John hesitated before putting them on. He had been wearing the same tattered clothes for years, their fabric fused to his existence. To change into something new felt wrong, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. But he couldn't walk around in rags anymore. So, with a deep breath, he pulled on the clothes. They fit well, almost too well. For the first time in years, John Turner didn't look like a homeless man. He looked like a man trying to find his way back, confronting the pain. When he emerged from the bathroom, Fred was waiting in the living room. The moment their eyes met, something passed between them. Fred's gaze flicked over John, taking in the clean clothes, the freshly shaven face, the damp hair no longer matted with filth. "You look..." Fred hesitated. "Different." John let out a rough chuckle. "Yeah, well, it was long overdue." Fred nodded, then gestured toward the couch. "Sit with me." John hesitated. Something about the way Fred said it made his chest tighten. This wasn't just small talk. This was something more. He sat. Fred exhaled, rubbing his hands together before speaking. "I need to ask you something, Dad." John stiffened. There it was. The real reason Fred had taken him in. He braced himself for what would come next. "Why did you leave?" Fred's voice was quiet. "Why didn't you come back?" John inhaled sharply. For a moment, he couldn't speak. How could he even begin to explain? How could he tell his son that war had broken him? That the man who had left for Afghanistan hadn't been the same man who returned? That the horrors he had seen, the lives he had taken, had erased him? How could he explain that coming home had felt impossible? That he had tried. God, he had tried. But the nightmares had been too much. The guilt too heavy. That every time he had closed his eyes, he had seen the faces of the men he had killed, of the friends he had lost, of the son he had left behind. John swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you." Fred frowned. "Protecting me? From what?" John clenched his fists. "From me." The silence stretched between them. Then, "You weren't supposed to protect me, Dad," Fred said softly. "You were supposed to fight for me." John flinched, because he knew Fred was right. He had spent years blaming the world, blaming war, blaming everything except himself. And now he had to face it. Face his son. Face his past. Face who he had become. John let out a slow breath. Maybe this wasn't just about finding a home. Maybe this was about finding himself again. And for the first time in 17 years, John Turner was willing to try. "The man I used to be." John Turner sat in silence, staring at the floor, his breath slow and measured. The weight of his son's words still lingered in the air, heavier than anything he had carried before. "You weren't supposed to protect me, Dad. You were supposed to fight for me." It echoed in his mind, over and over, like a war drum. Fred was right. John had run. He had justified it in 1,000 ways, convinced himself that his absence was mercy, that he had been saving Fred from the wreckage of a man who could no longer hold himself together. But now, face to face with the son he had abandoned, he saw the truth for what it was. Cowardice. John Turner had been a soldier once. He had faced bullets, explosions, death itself. He had never run from an enemy, but he had run from his own son. His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I should have come back," he finally admitted, his voice hoarse. "I should have fought harder." Fred nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, you should have." Silence. Then, to John's surprise, Fred let out a shaky sigh. "But you're here now." The words caught John off guard. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. The ghosts of yesterday. The next few days were strange. John found himself adjusting, slowly, to a life he had long since forgotten. He woke up in a bed instead of on concrete. He ate food that didn't come from a dumpster. He wore clean clothes that didn't reek of the streets. The small, simple luxuries felt foreign, but what unsettled him the most was the quiet. For 17 years, he had lived with the constant hum of the city, the sounds of passing cars, sirens in the distance, the murmur of people who pretended not to see him. He had slept in places where he could hear rats scurrying, where footsteps meant danger, where every sound kept him on edge. Now, the silence of Fred's home was almost deafening, and in that silence, his past had nowhere to hide. He would wake in the middle of the night, his chest tight with panic, drenched in sweat from dreams he couldn't shake. The war, the streets, the faces of those he had lost. One night, he found himself standing in front of the large windows in the living room, staring out at the quiet street, his hands trembling. "You were supposed to fight for me." The words refused to leave him. He had lost so much time. Too much time. Could he ever make up for it? A second chance, a different battle. One morning, Fred walked into the kitchen holding a folder. "I found something," he said, setting it down on the table. John, still nursing his coffee, eyed it warily. "What is it?" "A program for veterans." John tensed. "It offers therapy, housing assistance, a way to get back on your feet." John's jaw tightened. "You think I need therapy? I think you need help." John's fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "I've been fine on my own." Fred let out a sharp breath. "Dad, you've been surviving. That's not the same as living." John's chest tightened. He hated how right his son was. Fred softened. "You don't have to do this alone." John swallowed. His pride told him to refuse, to insist that he could handle things his own way. But where had that gotten him? 17 years on the streets. 17 years of drowning in a bottle. 17 years of regret. He exhaled, staring at the folder for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll go," he murmured. "I'll try." Fred's shoulders sagged with relief. Good. For the first time in a long time, John Turner was stepping into the unknown, not as a man running from his past, but as a man trying to fix it. The first step, the first therapy session, was brutal. John sat in a small, sterile room, facing a woman with kind but unrelenting eyes. She introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Graves. She didn't start with easy questions. "Tell me about the war," she said. John flinched. He didn't want to. But for the first time in his life, he forced himself to speak. He told her about the sand, the heat, the gunfire that never stopped. He told her about the men who had died, the friends he had buried, the nightmares that had followed him home. And then, he told her about what happened after, how he had tried to rebuild his life, how he had failed, how he had lost his family, how the weight of his past had driven him to the streets. By the time the session ended, John felt like he had been stripped raw. But when he walked out of that office, something had changed. The burden was still there. The memories still haunted him. But for the first time in 17 years, he had spoken them aloud. And that felt like the first real step forward. More than just a name. Weeks passed. Slowly, things began to shift. John kept going to therapy, kept talking, kept facing the past instead of running from it. Fred helped him apply for veteran benefits. He got official identification again, a name, a place in the system, a chance. One evening, as John sat at the dinner table, looking over some paperwork, Fred slid something across the table toward him. A small key. John frowned. "What's this?" Fred hesitated. "Your own place." John's breath hitched. Fred continued. "It's not far from here. A small apartment, nothing fancy, but it's yours. No more sleeping on the streets. No more feeling like you don't belong." John stared at the key, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He had nothing. No savings. No career. But for the first time in 17 years, he had a place of his own. His throat tightened, emotion clawing its way up. He looked up at Fred. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Fred's expression softened. "Because you're my dad." John swallowed hard. He had never expected this. Never expected redemption. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe he still had one last fight left in him. And this time, he wouldn't run. He would fight. For himself. For his son. For the man he used to be.